The mail-order bride thought no one wanted her, until a little girl whispered, "Can you be my mommy?" The sun was already sinking low behind the jagged mountains, casting a fiery orange hue over the endless plains. The wind howled through the dry, cracked earth, kicking up dust and sending it swirling in every direction. It was a desolate stretch of land, lonely, empty, and unforgiving. And there she was, standing at the edge of the small train platform, as if forgotten by time itself. Before we begin this journey, subscribe to Wild Western Tales for more tales of heartbreak, survival, and the wildest kind of love. Trust me, you won't want to miss the twists and turns in stories like this. Now, let's get started. Clara Ray's heart was heavy. Her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of a world that had never quite embraced her. She clutched a weathered carpet bag tightly in her gloved hands, the rough edges of the fabric cutting into her skin. The train had long since vanished into the horizon, and with it, the last semblance of hope she had for a future she dreamed of. The last passengers had disappeared into the town, greeted with warm hugs and familiar faces. But no one came for Clara. Not today, not ever. She had traveled all this way, trusting the letter, trusting the promise of a new life that had been written in bold, confident words by a man she had never met. "I have a quiet home, a warm hearth, and a place for a kind soul to belong," the letter had said. She had held on to those words, carried them with her for miles. But now they meant nothing. The silence around her was deafening. She sat on the cold, rough-hewn bench, her spine straight as if trying to fight the humiliation that threatened to overtake her. The letter was in her hands again, the edges worn soft from being read too many times. She had memorized every line, every promise, but still no one came. She had been promised a life, one that would make her feel wanted. She had been told she would find someone who would see her for more than her past. But the past was never far behind. Was it? From behind her, she heard a low laugh. Two young men stood leaning against a barrel, their grins wide and mocking. One of them snorted, breaking the silence with a voice full of derision. "There she is, the half-blood bookkeeper. Thought she could marry a rancher, huh?" Clara's stomach twisted, and she lowered her head, the familiar sting of their words cutting deep. She had grown used to it over the years, the sneers, the whispers, the judgment. Half-blood, they called her. The daughter of a Comanche woman and a cavalry officer. They didn't even call her by name, just a label, a thing to be discarded. Her own mother had never chosen her father. She'd been taken, and that blood ran deep, thicker than anything Clara could ever change. She tried not to let it show. She hadn't cried in front of anyone for years, but now, tears welled up, hot and swift, burning against the cold wind that whipped through the barren landscape. She blinked them back, but the ache was still there, the hurt sharp and unforgiving. She wiped at her face with her sleeve, determined not to show weakness. But just as she did, a soft voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and clear. "Are you hurt?" Clara blinked, startled. A small girl stood before her, no older than 3. The child was bundled in a wool coat that seemed too large for her, and mittens hung from a string around her neck. Her golden curls peeked out from beneath a knit cap, and her eyes were wide with genuine concern. Clara hesitated, trying to smile, trying to hide the rawness that she felt deep in her chest. "No, sweetheart, I'm just a little sad." The child studied her, her brow furrowed in deep thought. Then she asked, "Did your daddy say no?" Clara froze, the question catching her off guard. She blinked, trying to find the words. "No, darling. No one said no." The girl tilted her head, as though confused. "Do you have a husband?" Clara shook her head, the sadness pulling at her chest again. "No. Do you have a baby?" the child asked, her voice bright and innocent. Another shake of Clara's head. Her heart felt as though it were breaking in two. "No, sweetheart. Nobody wants me." For a long moment, the girl stood there, looking up at her with big, trusting eyes. Then, in the softest voice, she asked, "Can you be my mommy forever?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. The question was so simple, so pure, and yet it hit her like a tidal wave. She had never been asked such a thing before, not in all the years of her life. She had never thought that anyone, especially a child, would want her. Not with the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Not with the weight of her past. The silence hung between them for a moment, and just as Clara was about to speak, a man's voice broke through the stillness. Junie. The little girl's name was called with a calm authority, and Clara turned to see a man standing behind her. He was older than her by a few years, with broad shoulders and dark hair that was weathered from too many days under the sun. His coat was patched in places, his hat worn from long rides, but his eyes were what drew Clara in. They were quiet, observant, but held a depth that seemed to understand without needing to speak. He moved toward her, one hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder as he stepped closer. He nodded toward Clara. Sorry, she's got a soft heart. Clara stood, brushing the hem of her skirt down, trying to regain her composure. No trouble. She just surprised me. The man looked at her for a long moment, and Clara could feel his gaze lingering on the crumpled letter in her hand. You waiting on someone? Clara hesitated, then nodded. I was, but it seems I've been fooled again. The man nodded slowly, as if understanding more than words could say. He looked down at the little girl. You've got no place to stay. No, Clara whispered, but I'll manage. He stared at her for a moment longer, his eyes unreadable. Then he shifted the sack he carried to his other arm and spoke again. It's cold. If you want a roof and some warm broth, you're welcome to rest a while. Clara blinked in surprise. I don't even know your name. Luke, he said simply. Luke Harrison. He gestured toward the path. It's not far. You can leave after supper if you still want to. Clara looked down at the little girl, who was still holding her hand with that same, unshakable certainty. Then Clara nodded. Thank you. And just like that, she followed the man and his daughter into the fading light of the Montana dusk. Not with hope, but with the faintest flicker of warmth, like a match lit in the wind. The path leading to Luke Harrison's cabin wound through thin pines and rocky hills, the land broken and jagged beneath the weight of winter's first chill. Clara's boots crunched softly in the gravel as they walked, the man and his child ahead of her. Junie's small hand still clutched hers, her mittened fingers warm against Clara's cold skin. The silence was comfortable, yet heavy with unspoken words. Clara had no idea where they were headed, no more than she knew what to expect. She'd been brought to a place so far from the world she had known, a place she could never have imagined. What had begun as a quiet hope for a fresh start now felt like a question with no answer, a journey she was taking blindly, with no promise of what lay ahead. They reached the cabin by the time the sky had deepened into a violet dusk, the sun finally sinking behind the mountain peaks. The small house sat tucked in a hollow between trees, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, steady stream. It was humble, one room, a low porch, a small space that spoke of hard work and quiet living. There was no grandeur, no gilded promises, just the smell of burning wood and the sight of a life that had weathered time's harshest trials. Clara stood on the porch for a moment, her breath catching in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was waiting for permission to step inside or if she was simply too afraid to move. Junie tugged on her sleeve, pulling her from her thoughts. It's warm inside, the girl whispered, her voice light with the innocence of youth. Luke opened the door without a word, and the warmth from inside spilled out to meet Clara, wrapping around her like a cloak. She stepped into the cabin, her boots scraping softly against the wooden floor as Luke closed the door behind them. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough plank walls. There was a single bed in the far corner, the sheets rumpled as if someone had just gotten up. A small table sat in the center of the room, beside a rocking chair. The cabin was simple, but it was clean, and there was a kind of quiet peace that Clara hadn't felt in a long time. Luke gestured toward a hook by the door. You can hang your coat there, he said. Clara hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The warmth from the fire beckoned her, but something in her stayed rigid, cautious. She wasn't sure if she was allowed to let her guard down. I won't stay long, Clara said, her voice small in the quiet room. Luke didn't look up from where he was pulling off his boots. That's up to you, he said. But I didn't invite you here to stay forever. Just the night. Clara's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she nodded quickly, looking down at her hands. She could feel the heat of the fire on her face, but it did little to ease the cold that still clung to her chest. As Luke moved toward the hearth to tend the stew pot, Clara looked around. Her eyes landed on a small, beaded dress hanging in the corner, carefully folded and tucked behind a stack of blankets. It was made from rough, weathered fabric, the beads arranged in intricate patterns that spoke of tradition and care. Beside it was a shelf low, carved from wood, holding a few small items. A feather, a string of turquoise, a small pouch of dried sage. Clara's heart tightened. She stepped closer, reaching out a hand to touch the dress, the weight of the fabric heavy in her palm. It's for my daughter. Luke's voice was soft, almost too quiet. He hadn't turned around when he spoke, but Clara could feel the shift in the room, the subtle tension that filled the space between them. Kiowa, he added, his voice low, his words carrying more than the name itself. Clara froze. She knew that name. Her mouth went dry, and her mind raced to catch up. The name of a woman, someone from a past she had never been able to forget. Luke turned to face her then, his eyes unreadable, his features hard but softened by the weight of memories. She died last winter. The fever came fast and she didn't make it. It was over before I knew what happened. Clara's chest tightened. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Though she wasn't sure if the words came from the sympathy she felt for him or from the haunting recognition of her own loss. Luke didn't reply. He simply added another log to the fire, his back to her. The silence between them stretched again, thick with the weight of grief neither of them could voice. Later, after supper, Clara stood to leave. Her body ached, tired from the long journey, from the crushing weight of rejection she had carried with her all these years. She hadn't planned to stay here, not for longer than necessary. She was a woman with no place in the world, a woman who had been abandoned and forgotten too many times to count. I should go, Clara said, trying to force her voice to sound steady. But before she could reach the door, Junie slipped from her seat and ran to her. The child's small hands grabbed at Clara's skirts, clinging to her with a child's desperation. No, the child cried. You said you didn't have a house. This is one. Clara bent down, her heart aching at the sight of the girl's face, so filled with trust, so filled with love. She gently cupped the child's face in her hands, brushing back the tangled curls. Sweetheart, she whispered, this isn't my house. Junie's lip trembled. It can be just for a little, she insisted, her voice tiny but firm. Clara glanced up at Luke, uncertain of what to say. He stood near the hearth, his arms crossed, watching them both with a quiet intensity. She gets attached fast, Luke muttered, his voice rough. Clara turned back to the little girl. I'll sleep in the barn, she said softly, or by the hearth, just for tonight. Luke didn't speak right away. Then, with a quiet nod, he gestured to the cot in the corner. You can take the cot. I'll stay up. Clara was grateful, but something deep inside her stirred, a feeling she couldn't quite place. She wasn't sure if it was the warmth of the fire or the weight of her own loneliness, but she found herself hesitating at the threshold, wondering if she could ever truly let herself belong anywhere. The night passed quietly. Junie slept beside the dog, her tiny body curled up on the bench near the fire. Clara, wrapped in a blanket, sat by the window, watching the snow begin to fall softly outside. Luke stayed across the room, his gaze never leaving the child. Clara couldn't help but wonder about the man who stood so silently, so watchfully. She didn't know him, couldn't possibly understand the life he had lived. But in the silence, as the hours ticked by, Clara realized she was no longer alone. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like something she had to fight against. The fire crackled, its glow soft and inviting. But inside Clara's heart, a storm raged. It wasn't the cold of the night that left her restless as she lay awake, wrapped in the thick woolen blanket by the hearth. No, it was the gnawing ache of a lifetime spent searching for something she'd never found. A place to belong. Family. A home. She shifted uncomfortably on the cot, the scent of pine and herbs heavy in the air. She could hear Luke's quiet movements in the other room, the soft creak of the rocking chair as he sat, no doubt watching over Junie, his daughter. The child had fallen asleep long before, curled on the bench near the fire. It had been a long day for all of them, filled with unsaid words and quiet gestures that spoke louder than anything they could have said aloud. Clara's mind raced, caught between the bitter echoes of her past and the strange warmth she was beginning to feel here. Here, in this tiny cabin in the mountains of Montana, with Luke and his little girl. She had never meant to come here, not in this way. She had answered a letter, a foolish hope to escape the ghosts of her past. But what had she truly hoped for? To find a place where no one would see her as half-blood, as the daughter of a woman who had been taken? No, it was more than that. Clara had hoped for the kind of love that didn't come with strings attached, the kind that didn't care about the blood in her veins. And yet, here she was, alone with her thoughts, still not sure where she stood. She wanted to believe Luke, to believe that she could carve a place for herself here, but the doubt still lingered in her chest. She had been turned away so many times before, rejected, abandoned, or simply forgotten. How could she believe that this would be different? The wind outside howled louder now, rattling the wooden walls, and Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to will herself to sleep, to quiet the storm inside. But sleep wouldn't come, not when her heart was still so heavy, so uncertain. Morning came far too soon. Clara woke to the soft warmth of the fire, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the hearth. Junie was already up, her small face bright with the excitement of a new day. She stood by the window, watching the snow fall softly outside, her breath fogging up the glass as she pressed her little hands against it. Clara stretched, her muscles stiff from the night, and sat up on the cot. The world outside seemed quiet, serene, but inside the cabin, things were stirring. Luke had already started working, chopping wood by the door, his broad shoulders moving in rhythm with the axe. Clara stood, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself as she crossed the room. She watched him for a moment, the way he worked with such quiet intensity. His face was set in concentration, but there was something about the way he moved, something that made Clara think he didn't just work to survive, but because it was all he knew. She cleared her throat softly, unsure if she should interrupt his solitude. "Can I help with anything?" she asked quietly. Luke stopped, his axe resting on the ground, and turned to face her. He was silent for a moment, his eyes searching hers, as if measuring the weight of the question. Then he nodded. "There's breakfast on the stove. You can eat while I finish up here." Clara hesitated. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she was welcome here in the way he meant. But she knew one thing. She was starving. The journey had taken more than just her strength. It had taken her spirit, her belief in herself. And as much as she wanted to be strong, to stand on her own, she knew she couldn't carry this burden any longer. She stepped toward the stove, where a pot of stew simmered, filling the cabin with a rich, savory aroma. Junie had already set the table, her tiny hands reaching for the bread, her lips stained with jam. "Good morning, Miss Clara," the little girl chirped, her voice bright as always. "Papa said you can help today. I got my own chores too." Clara smiled at the child, the warmth in her chest spreading. "I see that. You're quite the helper." Junie grinned proudly, her pigtails bouncing as she hopped in place. "I do lots. Papa said I'm getting big now. I help with the chickens and the garden too." Clara's heart swelled with a mix of sadness and warmth. She had always wanted a family, someone to care for, someone to care for her. But could she really do this? Could she take on the role of a mother, even if the girl had never asked for one? She sat down at the table, forcing herself to focus on the meal before her. The stew was hot, comforting, and she ate in silence, the warmth spreading through her body as she chewed slowly. There was no need to speak. Not yet. Not when she didn't know the answer to the question that had haunted her all night. By mid-afternoon, the cabin was quiet again, the sounds of the outside world muffled by the snow. Clara had finished her chores for the day, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, and tending to the fire. Her muscles ached from the work, but it was a good kind of ache. It reminded her that she was capable of more than just surviving. She was capable of living. Luke had disappeared outside, his presence like a shadow on the land. But Clara didn't feel his absence as keenly as she had before. She was beginning to understand him, to see the quiet strength in the man who had taken her in without question. He didn't need to speak much, didn't need to offer grand gestures. His actions said everything. The wind had picked up again, a fierce gust blowing snow against the cabin windows. Clara stood by the hearth, gazing out at the white landscape, lost in thought. The warmth of the fire was comforting, but it didn't stop the restlessness inside her. The ache, the need to be seen, the need to be wanted. She could feel it, the pull between them, the tension that lay heavy between her and Luke, the things they didn't say, the things they didn't have to. She had come here for a fresh start, but what if the fresh start was never truly hers to take? That evening, after supper, Clara sat by the window again, her hands folded in her lap, staring out at the moonlit snow. Junie was asleep in her small cot by the fire, the child's tiny body curled beneath a quilt. Luke was across the room, sitting in his chair, his back to her as he worked on mending a tool. Clara's thoughts raced. She couldn't stay here forever. Could she? A stranger in a strange land. What was she supposed to do when she didn't know who she was anymore? What did she have to offer? She had always been a shadow, never really seen, never really wanted. Luke! Clara's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it reached him, and he turned his head to face her. He said nothing, just studied her with those quiet, steady eyes. She swallowed, forcing the words out. "You've been kind to me. I don't deserve it. I've never deserved kindness." Luke's expression softened, and for a moment, he didn't speak, just crossed the room and sat beside her. The fire crackled softly between them. "You're here, Clara," he said quietly. "You don't have to be anything else." Clara looked at him, unsure of what to say. His words were simple, but they settled over her like a heavy, unspoken truth. She wasn't just a woman passing through. She wasn't just someone trying to find a place in the world. She had already found it, right here. As Clara lay in bed that night, her heart finally at peace, she realized that she had found a home. Not just in this small cabin, but in the family she had come to love. She didn't need a perfect past to start anew. She didn't need to be chosen by anyone to know that she belonged. Luke had given her a place, a reason, a family. And, for the first time in her life, she had chosen to stay. The next morning, as she sat with Junie at the table, the child turned to her with a bright smile and asked once more, "Can you be my mommy forever?" Clara's heart fluttered in her chest, and without hesitation, she reached out, her hands shaking with the weight of the words she had waited her whole life to say. "Yes," Clara whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around the child. "Yes, baby, I will be your mommy, forever." Behind them, Luke stood silently in the doorway, a soft smile playing at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in a long time, Clara didn't need to look over her shoulder. She had found her place. She had found her family. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever felt the weight of being forgotten, of being lost, then don't forget to subscribe to Wild Western Tales for more tales of love, redemption, and the wildest hearts that find each other against all odds. Tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story, because who knows, maybe the next one could be yours.